I think for me, the closest I am to God is when I'm doing music. Like,
We all know Gwen Stefani as a global music icon, but what many people either miss or simply never realized is that she was raised in a Catholic family and still practices her faith today. And honestly, that surprised me when I first found out. I started paying closer attention when she followed me on Instagram, and then even more when she lent her voice to the Hollow Prayer app, because that is not something you casually do if your Catholic identity is just cultural or nostalgic, especially in an entertainment industry that often prefers faith to stay quiet and out of the spotlight. So instead of guessing or assuming, let's hear directly from her as she talks about what it's like growing up in a Catholic home and how that early formation continues to shape the way she lives her faith today. Let's listen.
I mean, my dad is a Italian Catholic, so there's that. And then my mom, her dad was actually, he went to a Catholic military school when he was about 5 years old in Anaheim, and that's how he ended up in Anaheim. And he was very, like, strict Catholic. Like, he went to mass every day, and we'd be like, oh, there's Grandpa. You know, he's doing, collections and all that kind of stuff. So I guess that's how my mom, and my grandma was not Catholic. So she converted way later, actually. But we just grew up Catholic, and it was just like the rule. Like, you go to church every Sunday without fail, and you're gonna do your catechism classes, which to me were all the bad kids. Like, when I would get there, it would be like at night, and I'd be scared, and it would be like all these rowdy kids, and that you didn't know because it wasn't from your school, because I didn't go to Catholic school. And I feel like it was like in our family, but it wasn't like we came home and discussed it or we read the Bible together. I mean, maybe here and there, but we did grace every night, and it wasn't the way I feel like I am now, where I have all this like knowledge, you know what I mean? Which I call myself a baby Christian because I'm certainly a work in progress. I'm underground at this point. Like, I'm not even close to being on the mountain is where I want to be or need to be. But I think as a child, it was such a grounding thing. And my mom was the one that really, I think, planted the seed of faith in me. And she knew I needed that, and I was going to need it, and she was right.
As you just heard, the quiet and consistent faithfulness of her grandfather and her mother left a profound imprint on her heart, an imprint so powerful that even in the midst of fame, pressure, success, and the relentless noise of the entertainment industry, something within her kept leading her back toward God rather than away from Him. This is precisely why St. John Paul II insisted that parents are the first and primary educators of their children, not only in academic matters, but in faith, character, and moral vision. Yet in our time, we are witnessing the opposite pattern, where many parents gradually transfer that sacred responsibility to Catholic schools and parish programs while remaining spiritually passive at home, overlooking the truth that no institution, however good, can substitute for the daily witness of lived faith within the family itself. That widening gap between what parents are called to do and what often happens in practice is exactly what Bishop Aaron addresses in the next clip.
You know, Brandon, over the years, how many times parents have come to me, either in person or online, with some version of this question, like, Bishop, what is the church doing to keep our young people in the church? What is the church doing to get them back? Why doesn't the church do more? Of course, they're fair questions. Of course the church should be doing things and is involved. But in light of these findings especially, I feel totally confirmed in my intuition that the answer is right in front of you, totally under your control, is the most important thing. More important than any program or any initiative on the part of the church would be your own fidelity to Catholicism. A kid that sees his parents worshiping God, going to Mass, taking religion seriously, not just talking about it, but doing it, making it part of their daily and weekly practice, there is nothing more important. So it's not to, just hit the tennis ball back to the laity or throw the laity under the bus. It's simply to acknowledge this fact. More important than anything we could possibly do as an institutional church is what you can do, parents, in your own family. I think, Brandon, it totally confirms, my own experience growing up in this Catholic family. Why am I a Catholic, much less a priest and a bishop? Because my parents were. Because I saw my parents living this faith in a normal, unself-conscious way. It's just part of life. In fact, it's the most important part of life. I think I've told this story before, but when I was a little kid, we lived in Michigan at the time, so I would have been like 6 or 7. And my parents, of course, were at Sunday Mass. And my father was not a real tall man, but he was big, a big, broad-shouldered guy. And he'd been an athlete as a young man, and he was I thought the toughest, strongest person in the world, when I was 7 years old. And to see my father, unselfconsciously, kneeling in the pew, obviously deep in prayer. Well, I mean, to this day, it's vividly in my mind. And when you're 7 years old and you see that, you say, yeah, well, he's taking this with utter seriousness. He's the most important person in my life, and so of course I'll take it with utter seriousness. My mother, the same way. My mother, missing Mass, if she had had smallpox and cholera, she would have crawled to Mass on Sunday. I love the story. This is before I was consciously aware of things. But I've heard from family members and friends that when my parents were first married, they went to Mass every morning. The church wasn't that far from where they lived, this beautiful Queen of All Saints Basilica in Chicago. And they would go there to Mass every day. My mother, I've told this story, is often during Lent, she would commit herself to daily Mass. Well, my point is, it was just part of the natural rhythm of their lives. And we, of course, picked that up. So, yes, the most important thing is parents live your faith. Now, talk to pastoral people across the country over the years. You'll hear stories like, how many parents drop the kids off at religious education on Sunday morning and then, okay, see ya, I'm going to go home, I'll pick you up in an hour and a half, even though Mass is going on at that time. And the idea was, no, the parents should go to Mass, or maybe they bring the kids to Mass after, whatever the deal was. But these parents who would absent themselves, well, what's the kid gonna learn? Sure, I'm learning things in class, but my parents aren't taking this seriously. That's number one.
And this is not just a modern opinion or a pastoral preference, because if you want a solid biblical foundation for the idea that parents are responsible for forming their children in the faith, Scripture is very clear. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, God commands, "These words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." End quote. Which shows that faith formation is not meant to be occasional or outsourced, but woven into everyday life, at the dinner table, on the road, before bed, and in the normal flow of family routines. We also see the same pattern in 2 Timothy chapter 1, where St. Paul speaks about the sincere faith that first lived in Timothy's grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice before it flourished in him, giving us a clear example of how faith is passed on within the family before it ever becomes public mission. Biblically speaking, then, the family is not just a support system for faith formation, but its starting point, with schools and parishes helping and strengthening what parents have already begun at home. But here we need an important balance, because responsibility can easily be misunderstood. In the next clip, Bishop Barron explains that this sacred duty of forming children in the faith must not turn into harsh or rigid authoritarian control that tries to force belief through fear or pressure, but instead must be carried out with wisdom, patience, and love. Let's listen to what Bishop Barron has to say.
Right. If the problem, let's say pre-council, was more the former, now it's the latter. What I mean is, pre-council, maybe there was too much of a stress on, the authoritarian, you got to do it, and just the expectations and the demands, and then, threats and so on if it wasn't lived up to. Okay, I get it. But then did we overcorrect? I would say yes, in my experience. My generation, the ones after mine, I think that, the warmth and the love and the acceptance and no matter what and all that. And what he's putting his finger on is very wise, that it's a artful combination of the two that's the key to successful parenting. I remember, this is years ago, I'm in the parish, and this kid came to serve Mass. He had never served before. So I said, oh, hi, what are you doing here? And then his mom came back, and I said, hey, it's good to have whatever his name was, and I haven't seen him before. And she goes, yeah, he doesn't come to church. We decided just to kind of leave it up to him, and that when he came of age, he joined. So what he's doing now is he's trying out different religions. And I remember I had this, I hope not scolding, but frank conversation with her. I said, well, would you ever accept that logic when it comes to learning a sport or learning a musical instrument? Would you say like, yeah, go to practice when you feel like it? Yeah, if you think your coach has something good to say, pay attention, but otherwise, just do whatever you want. Well, of course not, because what she was doing there was she was erring on the side of the warmth and love and no matter what, with no authoritative expectation when it came to religion. Well, why do we think religion is different than these other areas of life? Of course, you give clear expectations. Of course, there's a sense of, consequence. If you don't live up to this expectation, there's going to be a consequence. That's not repugnant to, I love you no matter what. And I think every good parent knows that. But I think as usual, we've oscillated from one extreme to the other. And striking that balance is key for parents.
Would you have described your parents in that way, that they had an authoritative but warm parenting style?
Yeah, precisely. And they wouldn't have been able to articulate it probably quite that way. And my guess is, Brandon, a lot of parents at that time knew that in their bones. They knew intuitively. I mean, my parents had expectations, absolutely. Maybe I've told this story before, even on this program, about when I joined the altar boys as a little kid. I joined. And you know how it often happens with kids? I went to the first maybe couple of training sessions, and then I decided, no, I don't think I want to do this. And I told my father I was quitting. And he said, very gently but firmly, if you don't want to join something, you don't have to. But once you join, you stick with it. And I did. I did stick with it. And now I'm a bishop. But my point is, he knew, of course I knew, that if I had abandoned the altar service, my father would still love me. Of course I knew that. I didn't live in some nightmare of, unless I live up to these expectations, my father will reject me. But at the same time, I knew, he's expecting this of me, and I don't want to let him down. And he thinks I'm making a bad judgment here. So I knew both those things from my parents very clearly, and that's the fertile ground out of which very good things grow, but one or the other is a problem.
The parenting approach Bishop Barron describes is not soft or vague. It stands firmly on a biblical ground and holds authority and tenderness together. In Ephesians chapter 6, St. Paul says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord," which clearly shows that real discipline and intentional instruction are required. Yet at the same time, parents must not crush, embitter, or discourage their children through harshness. The same warning appears in Colossians chapter 3, where we are told, "Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged," reminding us that excessive severity can wound a child's heart and push them away rather than draw them toward God. At the same time, Scripture also warns against the opposite extreme of passivity. Deuteronomy chapter 6 again makes it clear that parents must actively teach and speak about God's commandments in daily life, which assumes leadership, intention, and example rather than an hands-off approach that waits for children to figure everything out on their own. Likewise, Proverbs chapter 13 says, "He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him," which in biblical language points not only to cruelty, but to loving correction and healthy boundaries, because love without guidance easily becomes neglect dressed up as kindness. And finally, in Hebrews chapter 12, we read, "The Lord disciplines the one he loves," showing us that even God himself forms his children through loving discipline, not as a tyrant who crushes freedom and not as a distant observer who allows chaos, but as a father who shapes and strengthens his children for their good. When you bring all these passages together, you see a clear biblical middle path. Parents are called to be firm in truth, but gentle in method, strong in conviction, but patient in approach, leading their children with real authority yet without oppression, which is exactly the balanced version of faith formation that Bishop Barron lays out. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.